Budget Committee. We will proceed with opening statements by myself and the ranking member, and then hear from our really terrific array of witnesses here. But I have offered our distinguished chairman of the Finance Committee, who has an enormous role in all of this, the opportunity to give a short opening statement before I proceed and Senator Grassley proceeds. So, Senator Wyden, please make your statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and Senator Grassley for this courtesy, and I'm going to be very brief. Consistently, our colleagues on the other side of the aisle are writing tax legislation that gives billionaires a free pass. You don't have to take my word for these billionaire opportunities because they get outlined on the front pages of the Wall Street Journal. For example, Republicans consistently offer proposals that they state will protect Americans with under $400,000 in income from audits and bureaucratic hoops. We Democrats strongly agree that those with incomes of less than $400,000 shouldn't face those burdens. What Republicans don't tell the billionaires, that, as I say, is again on the front pages of the Wall Street Journal, is that billionaires often don't report income close to $400,000 because they live off their borrowings. So this can exempt them from bureaucratic hoops like audits, exempt them from taxes for years on end. And we've got a number of finance members, all of whom I like very much. Unfortunately, the Republican response has been, who cares? Well, I'll tell you, and I'll close with this, and I thank my colleagues all for their courtesy. The people who care are firefighters and nurses and teachers because they pay taxes with every single paycheck. And Social Security recipients, care, which is why what Senator Whitehouse and Senator Grassley are doing is so important. So we are going to keep fighting for a billionaire income tax. We're going to do it in a way that ensures that billionaires can continue to be very successful, have wonderful lives. We all support that. Every one of us supports that. But we also believe that there ought to be some fairness. And I thank you for your courtesy, Senator Whitehouse, to all of my colleagues for letting me do this. We got lots of finance members, and I'm looking forward to having a real debate with my colleagues on the point that I've made. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Wyden, and thank you, Ranking Member Grassley, for affording Chairman Wyden that courtesy. Since the start of this Congress, my distinguished ranking member and many of the Republican members of this committee have insisted we should focus only on rising debt and deficits. Because of what they portend for debt and deficits, I have looked at the enormous, well-documented costs and economic risks associated with climate change. These risks to our economy are deadly serious. But we have also held hearings on common-sense proposals to reduce debt and deficit with raised revenue from large corporations and wealthy individuals who too often skate in our rigged system. Today, I welcome a conversation with Republican colleagues about how to protect Social Security, which, according to CBO, along with Medicare, will make up more than half of spending growth over the next decade. With Social Security and Medicare accounting for so much future spending growth, you cannot have a serious conversation about our nation's fiscal situation if you only focus on non-defense discretionary spending, which represents less than 15% of total federal spending. Without new revenue, Social Security will only cover 80% of its projected benefits by 2035. That's only 12 years away. This hearing will therefore examine how to close that revenue gap to preserve the promise of Social Security for our kids and grandkids, working adults, and current retirees who will still be alive in 2035. Our promise to them is one we must not break. Social Security is the bedrock of retirement security and the nation's most effective anti-poverty program. It's a lifeline for millions of seniors, their children, and people with disabilities. In February of this year, that lifeline reached 20% of the entire U.S. population. Almost every senior in this country will receive payments from Social Security, benefits they have earned that let them retire in dignity. One of my constituents, Robert of Pawtucket, said, "I rely on my Social Security as my only source of income. I'd find it impossible to continue to live independently if Social Security were changed, reduced, or eliminated. Social Security benefits were a contract between the federal government and its citizens." Antonella of North Providence said, "I would be very sad and depressed if there were any cuts to Social Security. I'd just get by as it is." And Laurel, also of Pawtucket, said that without Social Security, she would have to go back to work and probably have to work until I die. For years, Republicans proposed slashing Social Security benefits, letting Wall Street gamble with seniors' retirement, or even sunsetting Social Security altogether. Then, at the State of the Union, President Biden received a bipartisan standing ovation from Republicans and Democrats alike when he proclaimed that cutting Social Security and Medicare was off the table. As he said that night, we got unanimity. So, this hearing proceeds under the premise that Republicans want to extend Social Security solvency and will stand by their commitment not to cut benefits. That, of course, leaves only one option: raising revenue. Fortunately, there are win-win common-sense solutions that would both extend Social Security solvency indefinitely without benefit cuts, while also making our rigged tax system fairer. Right now, the cap on Social Security contributions means a tech exec making $1 million effectively stops paying into the program at the end of February, while a school teacher making far less contributes their share through every single paycheck all year. That's not fair, and my Medicare and Social Security Fair Share Act would fix that by requiring contributions to Social Security on wages above $400,000. People living off income from their wealth make no Social Security contributions. That's not fair either, and my bill would also fix that. Those making more than $400,000 in investment income would contribute just like those who are earning wages. And right now, some wealthy owners of pass-through businesses like hedge funds and private equity firms avoid paying Medicare taxes entirely on much of their income. My bill would close this loophole. These reforms raise enough revenue to make Social Security solvent indefinitely, according to a new estimate from the Social Security Actuary, Mr. Steve Goss, who is our lead witness here today. Further, that legislation would extend Medicare solvency by 20 years. We can protect Social Security for all without cutting benefits, and we get to end unfair tax dodges that let those at the top play by a different set of rules than everyone else. Now, we could do even better and actually strengthen benefits, and I'm an original co-sponsor of Senators Sanders and Warren's Social Security Expansion Act, which would expand benefits by $2,400 each year while fully funding the program indefinitely. I welcome the bipartisan commitment not to cut Social Security, but it's not rock solid. MAGA Speaker McCarthy wanted Social Security cuts during the debt ceiling negotiations and has pledged to explore them. The House Republican Study Committee released a plan to cut Social Security by $718 billion over 10 years. The plan would also raise the retirement age to 69, which would effectively cut benefits by 13% every year and especially harm low-income workers. Raise revenue or cut benefits. These are the only two options. If Republicans stand by their commitment not to cut benefits, they must safeguard Social Security solvency by raising revenue. There is no other way to honor our promise to older Americans to retire with dignity. Over to you, Senator Grassley.
Well, before I start my statement, I was listening to Senator Wyden, and I don't ever pick a fight with Senator Wyden because he and I work together on so many pieces of legislation. But I keep thinking both what you said about taxing billionaires and what he was talking about keeps reminding me of something that Russell Long said many times. His last 6 years in the United States Senate was my first 6 years in the United States Senate. And he was a predecessor of Chairman Wyden, I think 16 or so years chairman of the of the Finance Committee, and I remember him saying so many times about the tax policy you ought to have. He kind of likened it to some bird or fowl. He says you need to go where you can get the most feathers with the least squawk. That's what his tax policy was, and it hasn't changed a lot in the last 50 years either. So, I guess starting out my statement, I can say, praise the Lord, we're finally talking about something about money and things the Budget Committee ought to be working on. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's hearing. Social Security solvency is exactly the kind of subject the Budget Committee ought to be reviewing. I hope we use today as an opportunity for thoughtful and constructive dialogue, because when it comes to Social Security, our constituents deserve more than partisan scaremongering. I'm glad that you agreed to invite the Director of the Congressional Budget Office, Dr. Swagel, to testify. It's the first time the CBO Director has testified before the committee that's got the proper name, the Budget Committee, on our nation's long-term fiscal challenges since way back September 2020. Social Security is part of the social fabric of America, and every Republican agrees with that as well. Social Security, we all know, is in trouble. But when you have candidates for president on the Republican side, and you have a Democratic president in office today say we're not going to touch Social Security, how do you get anything done? You know, it's not the Reagan, Tip O'Neill approach to things, where in 1983 this program was in trouble, and they said we got to get together, we got to save it, and they did. And maybe they thought they were doing something for 10 or 20 years, but it's worked out now for 50 years before you get cuts in Social Security when it's only going to be about 75 or 76% of what people receive today. So we don't argue about maintaining Social Security, and we resent anybody saying we want to do away with Social Security when you want to save it for the next 75 years. We have both the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office and the Biden's administration own Social Security trustees saying in about 10 years the program will be able to pay only 75 cents on the dollar. Doing nothing means cuts for everyone. Congress and the President consequently need to act. The longer we wait, the tougher it'll be to fix the problem. Back in 1983, as I just said, we had two outstanding people, one a Republican, one a Democrat, struck a deal to save Social Security. And that was with a combination of tax increases and benefit changes. While I hope we won't wait until the last minute, the only way to reach a deal on Social Security is to follow the Reagan-O'Neill model. That means Congress and the President working in a bipartisan fashion and keeping a range of options on the table. In fact, when I get asked by Iowans, what are you going to do about Social Security? I don't want to talk about the substantive issues, because unless you overcome the process issue dealing with Social Security, that we're going to get both the President and the Congress, and within the Congress, the Democrats and Republicans sitting down at the same table, nothing's going to get done. And then when you sit down at that table, everything's on the table. Unfortunately, President Biden has refused to provide any leadership on this issue. His budget includes $4 7/10 trillion in tax cuts, but not a single proposal to extend the solvency of Social Security Trust Fund. While some congressional Democrats have put forward their own proposals, these are tax-heavy messaging bills and not real solutions. These proposals would push the marginal tax rate above 50%, and many would break the president's promise not to raise taxes on anyone making less than $400,000. And look at the unrealistic aspect of raising marginal tax rates. In World War II and for a few years afterwards, it was 93%. But we didn't have anybody paying 93% of their income on taxes because they found ways to avoid. In other words, there's enough people in this country that are smart enough to know that I'm not going to work my lifetime and give all the money to the government. They're going to either choose leisure or they're going to have rewarding productivity. The truth is that taxes on the rich alone won't save Social Security for our children and grandchildren. If Democrats have a plan that you believe will permanently fix Social Security solely by taxing the rich, send it to CBO. They'll prioritize requests from the chairman of the committee. However, you're going to be disappointed when the nonpartisan answer you get back. One final point, since the program inception, Social Security has been financed primarily by dedicated payroll taxes paid by workers and their employers. That's because President Roosevelt wanted the program to have its own dedicated funding source and not be a welfare program and resemble a private pension plan where benefits you receive reflect the contributions you pay in. These twin principles of self-financing and earned benefits have been an integral part of Social Security for the last 88 years. But now Democrat proposals would break that tradition by introducing new revenue sources with no links whatsoever to benefits, just like income taxes or carbon tax. I'm not convinced we should abandon longstanding Social Security principles that have served well for 88 years, but if we do decide to look at new revenue sources, new taxes on family farms and small businesses aren't the answer. A better option would be to instead repeal the Manchin-Schumer reconciliation laws, the expensive and regressive new tax subsidies, and credit the savings to the Social Security Trust Fund. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. Our first witness today is Mr. Steve Goss, the Chief Actuary of the Social Security Administration, who with his team is responsible for evaluating the Social Security Trust Fund's solvency and the solvency effects of Social Security proposals. Mr. Goss has worked in the Social Security Administration for over 30 years and has served as Chief Actuary since 2001. After him, we will hear from the Honorable Dr. Philip Swagel, who is Director of the Congressional Budget Office, where he served as Director since his appointment in 2019. Prior to that, Swagel was a member of the Council of Economic Advisors during the Bush administration and served as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Economic Policy from 2006 to 2009. Ms. Kathleen Romig is the Director of Social Security and Disability Policy at the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities. Her work focuses on the need to expand Social Security benefits and the importance of the program in poverty alleviation. Romig previously served at the Social Security Administration and on the Social Security Advisory Board. Ms. Amy Hanauer is Executive Director at the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy and Executive Director at Citizens for Tax Justice. She is also Board Chair of the American Prospect magazine. Previously, she founded Policy Matters Ohio, which provided research that helped drive Ohio's increase to the minimum wage and establish its state earned income tax credit. Last, Dr. Andrew Biggs is a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies Social Security, state and local government pensions, and public sector pay and benefits. Previously, he was Principal Deputy Commissioner of the Social Security Administration, where he oversaw the agency's policy research efforts. He also served as an Associate Director of the White House National Economic Council, where he worked on Social Security reform. And in 2022, he was nominated by President Biden to serve on the Social Security Advisory Board. I welcome all the witnesses and invite Mr. Goss to begin with his statement.
Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, members of the committee, thank you very much for the invitation to come and talk to you today about Social Security, past, present, and future. We are now within 10 years of potential trust fund reserve depletion which in the absence of legislative action would make it impossible to continue pay in full benefits as they are scheduled in the law. More on this later. Under the intermediate assumptions of the 2023 Trustees Report, Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund reserves are projected to become depleted in 2033, so that continuing income would be sufficient to pay only 77% of scheduled benefits at that time. Even if we combine this fund with the disability insurance fund, which is a little bit better financed, our combined reserves are projected to become depleted in 2034, with only 80% of scheduled benefits then payable. This current situation should come as no surprise, as the trustees have been projecting combined fund reserve depletion between the years 2033 and 2035 ever since 2012, and very close to that prior. We have been here before. In 1982, the Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund faced an immediate crisis. The trust fund's reserves were depleted, requiring temporary borrowing that was provided by law from the Disability Insurance Fund and the Medical Hospital Insurance Fund to continue the payment of benefits. In 1983, the Social Security amendments of 1983 quickly followed, making changes needed to address the immediate shortfalls and to begin addressing the impending shift in the age distribution of the U.S. population that was already clear to all, based on the drop in the birth rate that occurred after 1965. By the year 2000, we had 20 people over 65 for every 100 people aged 20 to 64 working ages in our population. By 2040, we project we will have close to 40 people over 65 for every 100 people at ages 20 to 64 in the population. While the 1983 amendments were a good start, it was well understood at the time that they were not a permanent solution to Social Security's long-term projected shortfalls. The payroll tax rate was increased in that legislation to create excess income while the large baby boom generation would be still working. In 1983, we knew this generation, those born in 1946 through 1965, would begin retiring in 2008 and would gradually be replaced at working ages by subsequent lower birth rate generations. Excess annual income from that period prior to 2008 was anticipated through 2020 that would accumulate to cover shortfalls through the mid-2050s in what we were estimating for the 1983 amendments. It was known that further action would be needed by that time. So why are we now facing a need for action to avert trust fund reserve depletion in the mid-2030s, 20 years sooner than expected back in 1983? In the 1983 Trustees Report, we assumed an increase in average real earnings of about 24% between 1983 and 2000 over that 17-year period, and that the increase would be similar for workers at all earnings levels. Overall, average earnings actually increased by 28% in that period, even more than expected, increasing the taxable maximum by that same amount. However, the increase for those over the taxable maximum, the top 6% of workers, was 62% over that period, while it was only a 17% increase for the 94% of workers who were having earnings below the taxable maximum, a massive shift in the earnings distribution. As a result, the share of covered earnings that fell below our taxable maximum and therefore are subject to payroll tax dropped from 90% in 1983 to 82.5% in 2000. Other than temporary effects from recession since, this taxable ratio has remained at about the same level since 2000, and we expect it to remain there in the future. The other major unexpected change since 1983 was the performance of the economy, in particular the deep recession of 2007 and 2009. In that period, average real earnings grew by only 0.8% per year on average, as opposed to the 1.4% that had been expected. The chart on page 3 of my testimony illustrates the impact of these two major unanticipated events that have occurred since 1983. The drop in the share of earnings subject to the payroll tax increased the program cost as a percentage of taxable payroll to about the level now projected in the 2023 trustees report. So it's the primary driver. The recession of 2007 to 9, with a gradual recovery that followed, also increased cost in the period 2007 through 2020. Thus, the challenge before us is to, one, complete the work started in the 1983 amendments in addressing the effect of the changing age distribution of the U.S. population, and two, make further changes needed due to the redistribution of earnings between 1983 and 2000. In order to address these effects, we need changes to either reduce scheduled benefits by about 1/4 or to increase scheduled income for the program by about 1/3, or some combination of these two. The ultimate cost of the program at the end of this century is projected to be about 6% of GDP. Currently scheduled revenue will amount to only about 4.5%. Very much look forward to any questions and discussion of Chairman Whitehouse's recently scored bill and all other aspects. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much for being here, Mr. Goss. We're appreciate it, and we're grateful to you. Dr. Swagel, please proceed with your testimony.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee for inviting me to testify about the Social Security program. And it's a pleasure to participate with the distinguished experts on this panel. As you set out, the Social Security system faces a significant financial challenge as the resources available to the system under current law are not sufficient to cover scheduled benefits within the next decade. In our projections, the Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund is exhausted in 2032, and the Disability Insurance Trust Fund is exhausted in 2052. If the two trust funds were combined, in our projections, they would be exhausted in 2033. Now, after the trust funds are exhausted, we project that the resources available to pay benefits would be 25% less than the amount of scheduled benefits. Now, about 79 million people, which is about 1/5 of the population, will receive Social Security benefits in 2033. If all benefits were reduced by the same percentage, lower income households would reduce their spending by more and increase the amount by which they work by more in percentage terms than households with lifetime incomes. Legislative action would be needed to avoid this scenario. Now, the imbalance between the system's revenues and scheduled benefit payments extends beyond 2033, and it grows over time. We project that the actuarial deficit over the next 75 years would equal 1.7% of GDP, or 5.1% of taxable payroll. So that is that scheduled benefits could be paid through 2097 if payroll taxes were increased from the current 12.4% to 17.5%. That's a relative rise in the tax rate of 41%. Now, alternatively, a reduction in scheduled benefits of 27% would permit full payment of those smaller benefits through 2097. And of course, a combination of changes to taxes and benefits could also suffice, and policymakers can have different changes apply to people of different incomes and people of different ages. Now, additional changes would be needed, though, to ensure solvency beyond 2097. The aging of the population is a key factor affecting the finances of Social Security. In our projections, the number of people aged 65 or older who are less likely to work and pay payroll taxes and who are generally eligible for Social Security benefits, that share grows faster than the number of people aged 25 to 54 who are more likely to work and to pay payroll taxes. Now, population growth is determined by births, deaths, and net immigration. Fertility in our projections remains lower than replacement. We project that life expectancy continues to increase, even with what's happened with COVID and with overdoses and other things affecting younger adults. Immigration becomes an increasingly important part of overall population growth. Now, all of these demographic changes affect the financial status of Social Security. Let me say a feature of CBO's work on Social Security is that the demographic and economic projections we use in our Social Security analysis are the same as we use in our budgetary analysis. So everything is consistent between what we do in Social Security and what we do for other purposes. In closing, let me note that any projection over a horizon of 7 decades or more is uncertain. but it's clear that action is needed to make Social Security financially sustainable. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Director Swagel. And Ms. Romig, if you would please proceed with your statement. Thank you.
Good morning, Chairman Whitehouse and Ranking Member Grassley and members of the committee. Thanks so much for having me. Social Security, the nation's most effective poverty reduction and social insurance program, faces a funding gap in about a decade, as we heard from the previous witnesses. Policymakers must fill the gap in a way that keeps the program's promises and does more to protect people with low incomes. Social Security is critical for millions of seniors and people with disabilities because it is the largest source of income for most retirees. For 4 in 10, Social Security provides at least half of income, and for 1 in 7, it provides at least 90%. Benefits are much more modest than many people realize. The average retirement benefit is about $1,800 per month, or $22,000 a year. Social Security lifts more than 22 million people out of poverty, including 1 million children. Without Social Security, 38% of older adults would be in poverty, all else equal. With Social Security, only 10% are. And we have a chart showing that, I think. Social Security also provides important life and disability insurance protection. 1 in 5 beneficiaries receive either disability benefits or are young survivors of workers who died prematurely. Social Security is especially important for seniors of color, who are more likely than white seniors to face financial insecurity in retirement due to persistent economic barriers. We must preserve Social Security for future generations by addressing its real but manageable shortfall. As the chairman noted, there are really only 2 primary ways to close the gap: cutting Social Security benefits or increasing contributions to its trust funds. Senator Whitehouse's Medicare and Social Security Fair Share Act shows that it is possible to shore up Social Security without benefit cuts. Cutting Social Security would hurt millions, and it could even force many beneficiaries into poverty. Because most retirees have modest incomes, cuts would harm the middle class too. About 1 in 4 older households lives on less than $20,000 a year, and about half live on less than $50,000. Any proposal to raise Social Security's retirement age would mean benefit cuts for all new retirees, and they would impact lower and middle income beneficiaries most. Instead of harmful cuts, policymakers should increase Social Security's tax revenues, especially from those who can afford to contribute more. Since policymakers last addressed Social Security financing in 1983, inequality in the U.S. has skyrocketed in longevity, in earnings, and especially in wealth. Higher earners now enjoy significantly longer retirements, while longevity for the bottom half has stagnated, as shown in my second chart. Or even, in some cases, it has reversed. Longevity gains among high earners do not justify raising the retirement age and cutting benefits for all. Over the last 40 years, as Steve Goss noted, wages have grown far more rapidly among high earners than middle and lower earners. This inequality should be addressed by expanding Social Security's payroll tax base. While the vast majority of people get most of their income from their paychecks, a large and increasing share of income for the wealthiest comes from non-wage income, like investments, which enjoy many tax advantages. Policymakers should ensure that wealthy people pay a fair amount of taxes each year, and some of that revenue could be used to shore up Social Security. When policymakers update Social Security, they should also improve benefits for those who need them most. While Social Security lifts millions from poverty, significant hardship remains among the older and disabled people that Social Security is designed to help. Benefits are often too low for people who face career interruptions due to caregiving, poor health, or job loss, and policymakers should target these beneficiaries for more support. Now is the time to generate ideas to strengthen Social Security. Senator Whitehouse's new bill shows that raising revenue is key to protecting Social Security without making devastating cuts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Hanauer, you are recognized. Thank you for being here. Your microphone, please.
Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to testify. I will make two major points today. First, our tax system raises far too little from those with the most. And second, the Medicare and Social Security Fair Share Act would raise needed revenue for Social Security and is extremely well targeted to the very wealthy, raising taxes on just 2% of taxpayers. So first, the United States is a very wealthy country, but income and wealth are increasingly concentrated in the hands of a tiny few. The richest 1% of Americans took in 22% of our country's income in 2020, more than 1 out of every $5, as my first chart shows. Income inequality within that top 1% is even greater, and wealth inequality is worse still. Just 1/4% of households own nearly 1 in every $3 in this country. Despite these riches, we fail to deliver many of the basics to keep our families and communities strong. Taxes are one of the most powerful tools to rein in growing inequality while raising resources for shared needs, including Social Security and Medicare. Our economy is possible because of what taxes pay for, from schools to roads to financial systems. It is only reasonable that we ask the wealthy people who benefit most to pay into the society that makes that economy possible. In the middle of the last century, corporate tax rates, estate tax rates, and top income tax rates were much higher. But policymakers cut all three, all in ways that exacerbate inequality and reduce our ability to meet our obligations and stay solvent. We ran surpluses from 1998 to 2001 and were on course to fully keep pace with rising spending from the baby boomers retiring. But the Bush tax cuts, their bipartisan extensions, and the Trump tax cuts reversed that trajectory and created deficits every year since. Policymakers cut the corporate tax rates from over 50% in the 1950s to just 21% today, and enabled more businesses to organize as pass-through entities to completely avoid that tax. Policymakers cut the top individual income tax rate to 37%, less than half its former rate. And policymakers have cut the estate tax dramatically, so today an heir can inherit $24 million from his parents completely tax-free and can inherit still more tax-free through use of trusts. In short, we have directed repeated tax cuts toward the nation's most privileged. By contrast, as my next chart shows, policymakers have increased the Social Security tax, already a regressive tax, and made it more regressive by letting more earnings creep above the earnings cap. This means an increasing portion of our government is funded by a tax that poor and middle-income families pay more of, and I do have a third chart demonstrating that. So my second major point, the Medicare and Social Security Fair Share Act would require the richest Americans to pay taxes on nearly all of their income to fund these programs, just as most middle-class Americans already do. It does this by applying the Social Security tax to earned income over $400,000, increasing the top rate of the Medicare tax, and treating investment income of the richest Americans the same as their earnings from work. Finally, the bill would close the infamous Gingrich-Edwards loophole, which allows certain wealthy business owners to claim that their profits are neither investment income, subject to the investment tax, nor earned income, subject to the earnings tax. The bill would raise taxes on just 2% of taxpayers. Virtually all of those would be within the richest 5%, and 93% of the total increase would be paid by the richest 1% alone, households with average annual income over $2.5 million a year. I'll conclude by saying Social Security has been a major triumph of American policy. Before its establishment, many elderly Americans were in abject poverty. This vital part of our social contract represents a promise we've made to Americans' working families that you will pay in, and in return, you will be supported with dignity in retirement or in disability. Today's proposal would raise more from the very wealthiest, keep benefits intact, and shore up Social Security and Medicare for the next 75 years. Other proposals out there instead cut benefits, further cut taxes on the wealthy and corporations, and weaken our social contract. These are the two competing visions. In one, we increase inequality and do less to make America a good place to work and retire. The other, as in the legislation being discussed today, makes modest reforms to better tax those who are taking a larger share of our wealth and income and reinforces an essential pillar of our promise to Americans. Thank you.
And our final witness is Dr. Biggs. Please proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee. Social Security is the largest federal government program, the largest tax that most workers pay, and the largest source of income for most retirees. It also is underfunded by about 25% based on CBO and SSA projections. Any resolution of this funding gap must be perceived to be fair. And yet fairness is in the eye of the beholder. Since 1935, Social Security has framed fairness as a balance of individual equity and social adequacy. Equity means that each American receives a fair rate of return for their contributions. Adequacy tilts the benefit formula in favor of low earners to reduce poverty in old age and disability. Thus, while Social Security is progressive, it is not nearly so progressive as a typical so-called welfare program. This distinction was essential, and most agree it has contributed to Social Security's public support. Recent proposals would alter this ethos of equity and adequacy by filling Social Security's funding gap with significant tax increases imposed on high-income Americans. For instance, the newly introduced Medicare and Social Security Fairness Act would phase out the $160,000 payroll tax ceiling over about 25 years and immediately levy a 12.4% tax on investment income for taxpayers with incomes exceeding $400,000. The act would raise 10-year taxes by about $3 trillion, making it likely the largest peacetime tax increase in U.S. history. President Bill Clinton said this approach would, quote, tremendously change the whole Social Security system. It tells high earners, quote, we're going to soak you and you're never going to get anything out of this compared to what you're putting in. Every developed country has a Social Security-like pension system. I am aware of no country that runs a retirement plan similarly to how these proposals would. In Canada, for instance, the payroll tax extends only up to around $49,000 in earnings, while in the United Kingdom, the principal payroll tax is levied up to around $65,000, with only a 2% tax on earnings above that level. France, Sweden, and Switzerland have payroll tax ceilings roughly half those of the U.S. Finally, I would simply ask whether all these tax increases are necessary. Social Security benefits already are at record levels. An average new retiree in 2021 received monthly benefits that are 36% higher than a similar retiree in 2000, even after adjusting for inflation. A couple made up of two medium earners claiming benefits of the normal retirement age in 2023 will receive combined benefits of over $56,000, almost 3 times the federal poverty threshold before touching even a penny of their own savings. And Federal Reserve data show that retirement savings are at record levels in every age, income, educational, and racial or ethnic group. Total retirement plan assets today are 6 times higher than during the 1970s. Retirement incomes are at record highs, while poverty in old age has been declining for over 3 decades. Retirees have gone from being a disproportionately poor group to a disproportionately rich one. But there are approaches to Social Security reform that could help both sides. For instance, both Australia and New Zealand fund their government pension benefits using general tax revenues, not payroll taxes, making for a much more progressive source of income for the program. But these progressive taxes fund a much more targeted level of benefits that aims to guarantee against poverty, not provide generous benefits to middle and upper income retirees who are saving for retirement on their own at record levels. The current Social Security benefit, which for a single new retiree this year has a maximum value of over $43,000, is between 3 and 4 times higher than the maximum benefits paid in countries such as Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and Canada. No proposal that reflects the extreme end of one side of the political and economic spectrum will be enacted. Instead, both parties in Congress, Republicans and Democrats, should focus on working together to forge a compromise. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Biggs, is the point of your comparison with OECD countries that U.S. Social Security benefits are too high?
The comparison is that they are in fact higher.
You believe they are too high?
I believe the maximum benefit in the United States is too high, yes. $43,000 per year is far more than is needed to protect against poverty and old age.
Too high answers my question. Thank you. Mr. Goss, my Medicare and Social Security Fair Share Act would raise significant revenue for Social Security by ensuring that very high-income folks are put on the same footing as teachers and firefighters who contribute to the fund on every dollar they earn. For how many years do you estimate that bill would prolong Social Security solvency?
Thank you very much, Chairman Whitehouse. We did provide yesterday to everybody here, I believe, our estimates for that, and the revenue sources that you included in that bill, we indicate will result in Social Security being fully financed under the intermediate assumption of the 2023 Trustees Report throughout the entirety of the 75 years coming forward. And more than that, a concept that we actually developed back in the mid-90s called sustainable solvency, which requires not only the ability to fully pay the benefits during the 75-year period, but also to have the trust fund reserves stable or rising as a share of annual cost of the program.
And the bill would accomplish both of those things in the full 75-year projection window that you use.
Exactly.
Your testimony is that Social Security faces a shortfall now beginning in 2034. Is it correct that the only ways to ensure Social Security remains solvent are to either raise revenue or cut benefits? Isn't that not a arithmetic truth?
That is exactly correct. Thank you. It's under current law, the sources of income to Social Security are the payroll taxes and a small amount of tax on people's benefits that come to Social Security. And in order to continue to pay the scheduled level of benefits, we have to either increase the amount of revenue coming into the system through taxes, presumably, or to alter the law to lower the level of benefits that are scheduled. There really are no options. Social Security does not have...
Mr. Swigel, do you agree? That's a simple arithmetic truth?
Social Security has never had the ability to borrow from the general fund of the Treasury. It is not in the law to be able to do that, so there's no expectation of that. So we need to either raise tax
one or the other.
Or,
Mr. Swigel, you agree? One or the other?
Now, better demographics would help, but ultimately, yes, you need either more more taxes or to reduce benefits from what's now scheduled.
Ms. Hanauer, what are the ways that a $1 million earner can contribute a smaller share of their income to Social Security than a teacher or firefighter?
Thank you, Senator. A $1 million earner contributes less because there is an earnings cap that kicks in at about $177,000 next year, and nobody pays taxes on their earnings above that cap, and because investment income, which makes up a disproportionate share of the earnings of those $1 million earners, is not taxed at all for Social Security.
The investment income issue, who are the primary beneficiaries of that exemption?
The wealthiest Americans benefit most from the exemption on investment income.
Now, both you and Ms. Romig have talked about income inequality. Is it accurate to say that as American income inequality has worsened, more and more of America's national income has moved to high-income earners and therefore has moved beyond the reach of the existing Social Security revenue system?
Yes.
That's a function of income inequality as much, and it's had a direct effect on Social Security solvency.
Income inequality, and we have also cut taxes on those earners for other parts of our budget.
Ms. Romig, do you agree?
I do.
So income inequality has a pernicious effect on Social Security solvency unless we take steps to address both income inequality and Social Security solvency, which I contend my bill would do. Do you agree with that contention, Ms. Romig?
I do agree with that. Yeah, and I would add, as Steve Goss said, that this level of rising inequality was not anticipated in 1983 when we last addressed Social Security solvency.
And it's done wonders for high-income folks in America, which is terrific until you have a Social Security problem, and paying a fair share from the most successful and privileged Americans, then becomes an obvious place to bring the system back to solvency. And with that, let me turn to my distinguished ranking member, Senator Grassley, who will be followed by Senator Murray, our distinguished chairman of appropriations.
Dr. Swagel, when the Budget Committee wants to know how much a bill costs or saves, it's supposed to ask the Congressional Budget Committee in order to move the bill forward. Has CBO analyzed the effects of the White House on Social Security finances?
No, Senator, we have not.
Also for you, Dr. Swagel, when it comes to Social Security, the only way to determine if someone is paying their fair share is to look at both the taxes they pay and the benefits they receive in return. How much in benefits are the highest earning workers scheduled to receive for every dollar in taxes they pay? And contrary-wise, how does that compare to lower earners?
Okay, no, thank you. And we've analyzed that. So I'll talk about that for the different household incomes. So for the lowest quintile, so the lowest 20%, people with the lowest incomes over their lifetime have about a 2.5 to 1 ratio of their lifetime benefits against their lifetime taxes. So 2.5 times their benefits to taxes. The middle 20%, that ratio is about 1.5 to 1. The people with the top 20% of lifetime incomes, it's about 1 to 1, which means that's on average for the top 20%. Someone at the very top, the top 1%, like we saw in one of the charts, they would have a ratio of less than 1. So their lifetime benefits would be less than their lifetime contributions.
Dr. Biggs, some Democrat proposals would give extra benefits to wealthy people who don't use them or need them, and then ask future workers to pay up to pick up that tab. Do you think that these proposals are well targeted or fair to younger generations?
When we think about fairness, we want to think not just within generations, but across generations. Proposals that would increase benefits for current retirees, in particular for middle and higher income retirees, would grant benefits to retirees that they had not paid for themselves over the course of their careers. In other words, it would give benefits they had not earned. Of course, the bill has to be paid, which means that taxes on younger generations have to be higher to finance that. So generationally, that is inequitable, in particular because younger generations get a poorer deal from Social Security than older workers in the first place.
Okay. And Dr. Swagel, changes affecting Social Security can have unintended consequences for the rest of the federal budget. How would higher payroll taxes or new investment taxes dedicated to Social Security Trust Fund impact on-budget revenues?
Oh, okay. And our analysis of any Social Security program would look at those effects. So higher payroll taxes, for example, would mean lower take-home pay for workers, and that would affect workers' work effort, the labor supply. That, in turn, would affect the amount of income in the economy, and then the income generated by income taxes and payroll taxes. So that would affect the overall economy. There'd be many other effects, so we could do a full dynamic analysis. One other possible way that changes in taxes could affect the non-Social Security part of the budget would be if there's a transfer of revenue. So say there's a tax stream that now is going into general revenue. If that is, in some sense, moved into a trust fund instead, that would affect the overall budget as well. Or that would affect the non-Social Security part of the budget as well.
Dr. Swagel, the insolvency date on Social Security Trust Fund tends to get the most attention, but is that the only metric that Congress should look to gauge the program's financial health?
Yeah, I agree that gets the most attention, and we're very close on that with the actuaries. There's many other things you could look at. I mean, one would be in some sense, the cash flow of the system. Say the primary deficit today of the system of the benefits paid against the revenues coming in, the non-interest revenues. Today, it's a deficit of about $145 billion. That's rising above $500 billion over the next 10 years. So that's resources that need to be generated by the Treasury elsewhere to pay those benefits. You could look at distributional impacts. We've heard a lot about that, and then about sustainability as well, which other witnesses have talked about as well.
Dr. Biggs, we all know that demographics is a key driver of Social Security growing deficits, but is it the only driver, or are there other factors contributing to rising Social Security costs? That's probably have to give a short answer because my time's out, but go ahead.
Sure. The rate of growth of the economy matters because that affects wages and the taxes that are paid. And also under current law, the real level of benefits, even adjusted for inflation, increases from year to year. That means that costs will also increase. Demographics are the big driver, but there are other factors there as well.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Murray is recognized, followed by Senator Johnson and Senator Merkley.
Well, thank you very much, Chair Whitehouse, for holding this really important hearing. And I think it's important to remember that Social Security and Medicare are a promise that we make to our families that when you work hard, the benefits you earned will be there for you when you retire, and then if you have a disability, you're not left on your own. Social Security and Medicare are really a lifeline to people all across our country. People want us to save these programs because they know these programs save people. But in the long term, they are in danger, as we have heard, if we don't take action to shore them up. Last year, actually, Democrats took one of the biggest steps to strengthen Medicare in decades by giving it the ability to negotiate lower Medicare prescription drug prices, which is great news on Medicare for people who need those drugs, and it's great news for that program as a whole because it will save it billions of dollars each year. That should be common sense. And I was disappointed when we passed the IRA that so many Republicans stood with Big Pharma and voted against that bill because it was important on many accounts. Now, as we have heard today, there are two fundamental ways to save Social Security and Medicare for the future. First, we could raise revenue and save Social Security by simply asking the rich to finally pay their fair share, and there's nothing new or radical about that. For decades, our federal tax code has said if you have a higher income, you will chip in more. The radical thing is that right now, Social Security actually works in the opposite way. If you make around $160,000 a year, you are paying the same amount into Social Security each year as a billionaire. Someone can make over 12,000 times your salary, and yet their Social Security tax rate is a fraction of what your rate is. Think about that. Billionaires are putting just half a cent of every $100,000 they make into Social Security. It should be totally uncontroversial to suggest that we find ways to increase Social Security's revenue in order to extend its solvency and to make the system a little more fair. Now, anyone who says that is off the table has only one completely unacceptable option left, and that is to cut benefits. And over the years, some Republicans have called explicitly for cuts. We saw a plan to phase out Social Security last year. We saw House Republicans put forward a roadmap just last month to raise the retirement age. Nonetheless, we do hear Republicans act like they don't know why anyone would accuse them of wanting to cut Social Security. Make no mistake, if you are unwilling to even consider new revenue or making the ultra-wealthy pay their fair share, then you are essentially saying that the only option left for Social Security are benefit cuts. We are talking about a lifeline countless Americans have earned and they're counting on today and for decades to come. So I'm really interested in what the panels had today on how we can protect and strengthen Social Security, and the families rely on it. I appreciate all of you being here today. And as I said, we know millions of Americans are really struggling today to save for retirement or to make ends meet in retirement. In fact, you should know that half of seniors rely on Social Security for most of their income, and a quarter of seniors rely on Social Security for at least 90% of their income. So my question today is for Ms. Romig. Talk about what Social Security benefits mean for our country's seniors and how those cuts disproportionately impact women and communities of color.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'd just say, most retirees' incomes overall are modest, and so they really rely on those Social Security benefits to meet their basic needs, housing and food, health care and bills. And so cutting those benefits would really compromise the lifestyles of our nation's seniors and people with disabilities. And that's especially true for women and people of color. Women tend to earn less over their lifetimes, have smaller retirement savings accounts, and in addition, they tend to live longer. And there are features of Social Security that make it especially important for women. The progressive benefit formula that means they get a more generous share of their earnings replaced. The spouse and survivor benefits that go almost exclusively to female beneficiaries. And the inflation protection that ensures that the value of Social Security keeps up with the cost of living over even a very long retirement. And the same is true for people of color. People of color have faced economic inequality throughout all of this nation's history, and they're less likely to be offered retirement plans at work, less likely to have jobs with a margin for savings, and so Social Security is especially important for those groups. And in fact, without Social Security, over half of Black retirees would be in poverty, and 45% of Latino retirees would be in poverty.
Thank you very much for that answer. Mr. Chairman, thank you for having this hearing. I think it's really important that discussions about Social Security focus on solutions that actually protect our seniors and make sure they receive the hard-earned benefits that they worked decades to receive. And I really believe that cuts should be off the table, but I think this hearing is really important for us to really start focusing on this, so I thank you very much.
And we certainly hope that the bipartisan expression at the State of the Union that Social Security cuts should be off the table was not just theater, but was actual truth. And with that, let me turn to Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to thank you for holding this hearing, but also recognize we're just barely scratching the surface. What's frustrating to me is there's just so much basic fundamental information we need to convey to the American public, the misperceptions of the Social Security program, that we need to spend some time before we can start getting into all the details that have been brought up by our witnesses. So what I would suggest, rather than this format where we just kind of talk by each other, I've got 4.5 minutes left to make probably about 20 minutes worth of points. We ought to schedule an all-day roundtable and have a discussion, as Senator Murray talked about. Let's get this all out on the table. But in my remaining minutes, I'd like to talk about some of these fundamentals. When I talk to Wisconsinites, they just have a basic misperception about Social Security. I mean, I think this was originally sold as, okay, we are going to, as a nanny state, we're going to make sure that you're going to have money for retirement, so we're going to extract wages from, or taxes from your wages, and we're going to set up an account for you so that we're going to save it for you for your retirement, because we don't trust you to save for yourself. So most people think, well, that's my money. And in fact, a part of it is. But as Senator Grassley was talking about, if you're in the low-income group, you're getting a lot more in return than you ever invested in. So it's really not a savings account where where the government's saving for you, that amount builds up with the compound interest and stuff, and then you get that back in return. In fact, there's really not anything saved at all, correct, Mr. Goss? The money's gone. It comes in the Treasury, it's spent, right?
It's a pay-as-you-go system. The money coming in basically covers the cost.
It is. It's a pay-as-you-go system. Worked when we had 40 workers for every one retiree. Now we're less than 3 workers for every one. This is the Social Security Trust Fund, correct? It's a 4-drawer file in Parkersburg, West Virginia, correct? And it holds U.S. government bonds.
Well, it's all electronic. By law, this trust fund's going to be invested only.
Understand. So it is also true that a U.S. government bond held in the hands of a U.S. government entity literally has no value. What happens when, and by the way, the funding gap began in 2010 when benefits started exceeding revenue, correct? So now we start dipping into the trust fund. This gentleman pulls out a bond, sends it over to the Treasury, and says, pay us $50 billion. What does the Treasury do? They don't have $50 billion. They either just print it. I mean, Mr. Krause, what does the Treasury do?
Well, the vast majority of the payments that are coming out of Social Security now are from current.
Correct, but I
revenues
mean,
coming in.
when we.
But we are running cash.
We're dipping into this, and we're gonna exhaust this accounting convention. This thing's gonna be empty in 2023.
And that was intended in the 1983.
I understand, but again, I just want, so the American public understands what's happening.
Yeah.
A bond of this gets turned over to the Treasury, and then what does the Treasury do?
Well, the Treasury realizes the fact that Social Security has saved up this
No,
money.
but again, what is
avoiding borrowing from the
the
public.
actual transaction? A $50 billion bond is handed over to the Treasury. What does the Treasury do with that $50 billion bond? They pay the Social Security trustee
Exactly.
$50 billion. Where do they get the $50 billion?
From either current revenues or from borrowing from the public.
But the yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Right now they're borrowing because we're running $1 trillion deficit.
Yeah.
So they float another bond.
On the margin.
So it's very important for people to recognize that fact. Mr. Biggs, talk about, again, the fact that the calculation of what you get in benefits somewhat tied to what you've contributed, but certainly not totally tied, correct? And as we talked to the CBO director, again, on the lower end of the income scale, you're getting a lot more than what you paid in. If you're in the high income, you're not getting what you paid in. And wasn't that sort of the deal? This was not a general welfare system. This wasn't, this was really designed, we're going to make you save for your retirement, and then you're going to get back what you paid in. Just address that fact.
Sure. Social Security is set up as a contributory social insurance program where everybody pays in. People receive back a fair return on their money, and yet it is tilted towards low earners.
And again, I think most Americans agree with that.
Sure.
And just my final question, Ms. Hanauer, this is a very simple question. Out of $1 of income that any American makes, how much should be the maximum amount the government takes out in total? What is the total maximum tax rate on $1 of income? Because I always ask, progressive witnesses that question. What percent is the most that the government ever ought to take out of an American's dollar of income?
I think we should think about the kind of country we want to have and then have.
I just want a percent.
revenue.
I mean, you've already thought about that.
Possible to give a
How much do we ought to take out of $1 of income?
We had 400 billionaires who paid less than 8% tax rate, so more than that.
The top 1% pays 40% of all income taxes, okay? I don't know at what point in time is a fair share. It is telling that I can never get a progressive witness to tell me what the maximum percentage is they want to tax $1 of income. And you're not willing to do it
Senator,
either.
when we consider all taxes, the top 1% pays about 24% of taxes.
And they make
but
22%
receives
of income. That's pretty fair.
22% of income. It
They're
strikes
still
me
paying a
that they
higher
can do a
level of
little
tax
bit
than they
more.
get in the income.
It
So we can
strikes
argue with
me
that, but again,
in a
I'm just asking.
society where the wealthiest are getting more and more of our income, they can afford to chip in more to maintain the systems that enable them to build that wealth in the first place.
Mr. Chairman, this is why we need a longer discussion, so I don't have to be quite so rude in interrupting witnesses. We do need, the American public needs to hear this conversation. I think there could be all kinds of areas of agreement. And if you're going to do something on a bipartisan basis, rather than just, slap a piece of legislation on the table there and say, you're evil if you don't accept this thing, or you want to cut benefits, I want to save Social Security. I think everybody here in this hearing room wants to save Social Security, but in order to do so, we need a full-fledged discussion where all viewpoints can be heard and some of these realities can be laid out on the table. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Johnston. Senator Merkley, I'd take Chairman's prerogative just to note that it would make a very big difference to me in how much should be taxed on $1 of income, whether it was the first dollar of income of an individual or their billionth dollar of income. So I would just add that to the discussion. Senator Merkley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for bringing your expertise to bear. And I hold a lot of town halls, one in every county every year, all 36 counties open town hall. And oftentimes somebody will stand up and say, hey, isn't Social Security been raided? Hasn't the funds been stolen? And I'll give an answer that says no, that essentially the funds that are in the trust fund can either do nothing with them, in which they earn 0%, or you could invest them in the stock market and make the risk of a stock market crash wiping it out, or invest them in essentially the equivalent of Treasury bonds, which isn't the highest return in the world, but it pretty low risk in the U.S. government, which is why much of the world invests in them. Is that description kind of basically accurate, Mr. Goss?
It is exactly. In fact, the law requires that all revenues coming to Social Security be invested immediately in interest-bearing securities backed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. And
Yeah,
the $2.8 trillion that are held now are by the Social Security trust funds are $2.8 trillion that have not been borrowed from the public to this point because Social Security amassed that excess.
Thank you. I'm glad I'm not misleading Oregonians. And when I ask people, I'll often ask questions in my town hall, things like, would you all prefer to see it invested in the stock fund and the risk of having Social Security wiped out by crash? People respond, no. And I don't think that has changed. So it seems like a pretty stable strategy in place. And the rate that is earned on the funds that go from Social Security, that when they essentially buy bonds, is that basically the same as the Treasury bond rate? Yes, the same. So it'd be the same as if you or I invested in Treasury bonds, or anyone else? Okay, great. So one feature that has changed a lot in the retirement framework that I don't think we've really touched on is the tremendous increase in IRAs and 401ks and so forth as alternative strategies for retirement that really affect the upper income Americans. And I think the stat that I saw in the brief was that if you look at CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, they have an average of about $14 to $15 million in retirement funds. Now, those are generally incredibly tax favored. You put it in the retirement fund, you don't pay taxes on them. Why does it make sense that we are providing such a massive protection for those levels? Those aren't basic retirement levels. That's just a way to escape income taxes for very wealthy Americans. Is it considered that possibly we should rein that in? Like, for example, allow people to put into IRAs and 401ks several $1 million, but not, and some people have several $100 million, by the way, in such funds, and use the additional revenue to back up Social Security. Have any of you looked at that type of proposal, Ms. Romick?
I think that's a really good point. And often when we talk about the way that we do tax expenditures, and they are really expenditures of money on retirement savings, people refer to it as an upside-down system, where the wealthiest get the greatest advantages. The tax advantage for the wealthiest is much, much higher than it is for lower-income people who contribute to 401ks and IRAs, because it's based on our progressive income tax rates. And so, you're right, some of these accounts are enormous. Even Peter Thiel has one that's billions of dollars, an IRA that's billions of dollars. That's really more than he needs for his retirement. And so I think we need to look at this in the grand scheme about why are we giving such generous tax incentives to these so-called retirement accounts for very wealthy people that are really not needed to secure their incomes in retirement, where we're not asking them to pay a contribution to Social Security that is for everybody.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And Ms. Hanauer, did you have a comment on that?
I would just say we would love to analyze a proposal of that sort, and but I certainly agree with Ms. Romig that we need to think about the lowest income people and making sure that we can secure a retirement for them.
Mr. Chairman, I'll just note that in the past I've introduced legislation on this saying, yes, affluent people should be able to put significant money into IRAs and so forth, but there reaches a point at which there is not a public purpose in subsidizing massive increase in wealth for the very wealthiest people in America. They clearly have enough to retire on, and we might look at that as a source of income to strengthen Social Security for everyone else's retirement. Thank you.
Particularly if it's being used for tax dodging purposes. Senator Marshall.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I, too, want to add my thanks for holding this hearing. Certainly the people of Kansas sent me here to save and protect Medicare and Social Security. If you want me to save Medicare, I need a new innovative drug to help take care of the health care of 6 million people with Alzheimer's. Tackling Social Security is even a tougher one as we look for solutions out there. Dr. Biggs, would you agree with me that inflation disproportionately hurts a person who's living from Social Security check to Social Security check?
Actually, no, I wouldn't.
Why?
Because Social Security is adjusted for inflation. The rest of your
So you're telling me with 16% inflation and your Social Security check went up marginally, that person's not more significantly impacted?
No, it's, if I received 100% of my income from Social Security and Social Security COLA is accounted for inflation, my 100% of my income is inflation adjusted. If I received half of my income from Social Security and half from somewhere else, my total income is only half protected against inflation.
Oh, okay, that's certainly not one person, not one senior citizen has told me this. Every senior citizen I talk to in the state of Kansas, including my own parents, say groceries are up 20%. Gasoline prices went from $2 to $3.50 a gallon. That their utility bills, some of the utility bills have doubled, and certainly the Social Security check they're receiving is not touching that at all. I think that slowing down inflation would be one of the solutions to save Social Security. I'll stick with you, Dr. Biggs, since I hit a home run with that question. Would getting 7 million healthy American men between the ages of 25 and 45 back to work, would that help save Social Security? Would a strong economy help save Social Security?
Sure. Higher labor force participation means more people working, more people paying taxes. That would certainly help. Higher economic growth means the tax revenues grow faster than they otherwise would have. That would help Social Security as well.
So savings to save Social Security, it'd be a good idea to stop paying people more to stay home than to go back to work. Is there anybody on the panel that would say a strong economy would not help us save Social Security? Does anybody disagree with that, a strong economy? Is there any concern that if we raise the taxes enough, that it could actually hurt the economy? Dr. Biggs?
Sure. I think the scores you see from Social Security when they look at these proposals to increase taxes would generally not include an effect on how the incentives of that would affect earnings of people in that class. So you want, if you're, in my testimony I point out we're getting to very, very high marginal tax rates. We know that people do respond to those. There's some disagreement about how much, but you certainly need to bear that in mind.
Okay, going to my next question here. Let's talk about the national debt, $33 trillion. We might spend $700 billion of interest this year, which certainly fuels inflation and impacts seemingly everything else as well. So, Mr. Goss, how does that national debt and paying that much in interest, does it have any bearing, any indirect bearing on concern for saving Social Security?
That's a huge question. It has some bearing potentially if the debt continues to rise a lot. Could it have effect on interest rates? Higher interest rates would benefit Social Security for its revenues. But an important thing to keep in mind is of that $33 trillion, $2.8 trillion, almost 1/10 of it, is in fact money that is being held by the trust funds. And if the trust funds had not built up that $2.8 trillion worth of reserves by the excess payroll taxes paid over the last 20 or 30 years, the debt would still have to be $33 trillion. All of it would then be borrowed from the public. So if Social Security does indeed spend down its reserves and spends that $2.8 trillion, that simply means that the full $33 trillion, not all of which has been borrowed from the public as yet because Social Security has been helping out, would then have to go to the public. So we should not say that Social Security is causing an increase in debt. It's actually covering a portion of the debt right now by the excess income that's been paid
which
in
was
by workers.
not my question, but I appreciate the answer. Dr. Biggs, what solutions would you throw out there?
Things that I have argued for are certainly in the long term, slowing the growth of benefits for middle and high income retirees, raising benefits for the bottom third to truly guarantee against poverty and old age, but separately and importantly, making sure that every employee has a retirement plan available to them on the job and automatically enroll them in that retirement plan. If everybody were saving as they should and could for retirement, Social Security's job is much easier. That's how a country like Australia has lower poverty in old age than we do, while their Social Security costs are going to be going down in the future and ours are going up. So we need to think a little more creatively about this.
Thank you. I yield back.
Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Couple questions.
Followed by Senator
First
Braun. Sorry to interrupt, just to let Mike know that he's next.
Okay. The first is sort of an extension of a topic that Senator Murray was talking about earlier in terms of equity of the Social Security system. My understanding is that even with Social Security, there are more than 5 million seniors in the United States currently living in poverty. Roughly 1 in 7 seniors rely on Social Security for more than 90% of their income. And the number of Americans who are at risk of not being able to maintain their standard of living in old age or retirement age has increased over the past 30 years. And this is particularly true for lower income and marginalized communities that have had fewer opportunities to save, earn pensions, et cetera, especially among Black and Latino elder adults. Question is for Ms. Romig. How does rising income and wealth inequality affect Social Security financing and benefits, and what recommendations would you have to make the system more equitable?
That's a terrific question. Certainly on the financing side, as we've been talking about, this rising inequality of the last 40 years, since the last time Congress addressed Social Security, was not anticipated. And so we are getting fewer payroll taxes from high-income earners than we would have if the payroll tax cap was set at the same level that it had been 40 years ago. And so we've lost a lot of revenue for the system during that period of the last 40 years. And that's certainly not equitable. And as Amy discussed, also this rise of people getting income from other sources that are not taxed by Social Security, investment income and pass-through income and things like that, the highest income people are contributing a much smaller share of their total incomes to Social Security than regular folks who get their income from paychecks. And so those are really important factors that we need to think about now that we are aware of these trends to make sure that Social Security is equitably financed. And the same is true on the benefit side. The increase in longevity over the past 40 years since we last addressed Social Security has meant that wealthier people are living significantly longer. That's not true for the bottom half. And in fact, the reverse is true for some marginalized groups. We hear about these deaths of despair, especially in marginalized communities where life expectancy is actually shorter than for their parents or grandparents. So that means they're getting benefits for a shorter amount of time, whereas wealthier folks are getting benefits for more years. And so we need to address that as well.
Yeah, that's a troubling dynamic. But on the first half of your answer, fair to take away that tax breaks for the most wealthy and large corporations are not good for Social Security?
That's right.
Thank you. Second area is the following. Now, since 2010, the number of Social Security beneficiaries has increased by 21%. And this is sort of the precursor to your longevity dynamic that you just described. Our nation's age dependency ratio is now projected to reach 44% by 2040. Absent congressional action, an aging population and a shrinking workforce will continue to threaten Social Security financing. That's a dynamic that I think most of us are very well aware of and are concerned about. Now, while not a solution in isolation, right, this is not a magic wand, but we know, history tells us that higher levels of immigration can improve the long-term financial health of the system. Immigrants, on average, are younger than the native-born population and have higher labor force participation rates. And just to top that, by the way, the studies by the Cato Institute from 2013 and 2018 also found that Social Security eligible immigrants use benefits at lower rates. So there's a group of folks that's paying into the system disproportionately than what they're taking out of it. Questions for Mr. Swagel and Mr. Goss. We already know that immigration benefits the economy overall. But can you speak specifically to how updating our immigration system could support the long-term solvency of the social security system?
Maybe I'll say a quick word and Steve can finish. No, it's absolutely right that more immigration would reverse aging and would reverse the shrinking of the workforce that you talked about. That would have a near-term impact in improving the finances of Social Security. There'd be long-term benefits as well, long-term impacts as well. There'd be higher productivity growth from immigrants, and immigrants start companies, they hire workers, that means more payrolls and more revenues into the system. And we would analyze both those, the near-term and the long-term impacts.
So from a purely demographic point of view, our issue, as we've mentioned, has been the changing age distribution because of the drop on the birth rates after 1965. Now, birth rates are when people enter our population at age 0. Immigrants enter our population generally between 20 and 35. So that if we have an increase in immigration, if our policy were to change, that would bring more people into our population precisely at the ages at which people begin to really enter the workforce and work. So it could potentially change our distribution of the 20 to 64 age group, working age, versus the 65 and over, and have a very positive effect. There's no question about that. And in addition, immigrants tend, by and large, at least in the early years, in the country to have higher birth rates even than the general population. So it's really a plus all the way around.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just in closing, want to underscore, at a time where we're seeing persistent record low unemployment levels, we're not talking about immigrants coming here to take jobs from anybody else. We need the workforce. And I've heard that from leaders in every industry across the board. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Talk to a hospital or a nursing home. Senator Braun.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Something I hear so often about back in Indiana would be the unfairness of WEP and GPO, windfall elimination provision, and government pension offset. I'm not going to ask a question here, but I want to point out that seems like an inherent unfairness just due to the nature of your job. And I want to put it in the context that some things need to be fixed, but when you're doing it in the context of now nearly structuralized $2 trillion deficits annually, I think the only budget out there that's been really put there to the public would be Biden's, and I think it takes us from $32 trillion in debt currently up to $52 trillion roughly. Mr. Schwagel, is that correct generally in terms of blueprints for our country?
Yeah, that would be right.
So this is something we probably ought to fix. It's an inherent unfairness to a group of people that serve our country well, school teachers and police officers. But here we're in a mess where we built the system into such a terrible long-term business plan. Senator Johnson has had the most relevant question. You need to start asking, where is enough enough? I think we've grown over the last 2 years of enterprising with the Biden administration to where government in our country is way above the historical average of wherever it's been. I believe that we need it. We need to save Social Security and Medicare. This doesn't seem like a very practical discussion in terms of how do we do it when you're hemorrhaging that much year after year. So when it comes down to, I'm going to ask you, Mr. Schwagel, where do you see the total government expenditures being? We know where the Biden budget wants to take it. If that's what Bidenomics is about, that's a destiny towards a Chapter 11 for the government someday. Are these numbers that ominous in terms of the blueprint out there currently for the biggest business in the world?
We analyze the budget under current law, and the near-term challenge under current law is net interest payments, right? So which are rising sharply from less than $500 billion a year ago, and are set to triple over the next 10 years. So that's kind of the near-term challenge. And then the entitlements, we're talking about Social Security Day, Medicare is just after that. So once you get to the kind of 9-10-year horizon, the entitlements are really the driver of the fiscal challenge.
They're the structural drivers. And then would you say Medicare is more significant in driving that, or Social Security? And which, again, you don't like to talk about policy, just tell me which of the two is growing in the wrong direction most precipitously.
Social Security is closer, but as you look over time and into the sort of far off decades, the increment in Medicare is.
And you know why? Because as little as 30, 35 years ago, that was 5 to 7% of our GDP. Now it's approaching 20, and that's another issue. It's the biggest sector of our economy that hides itself behind free enterprise, and there's no transparency. There are barriers to entry. If we want to focus on policy that would really make a difference, that'd probably be the thing we could do, but we're still then beset with a business plan that has to start begging the question, how much do you want through government? Am I correct in saying that revenues over a 50-year period have been stubbornly in a narrow bracket?
That's right. The 50-year average of revenues is about 17.4%
Okay.
GDP. So right around there.
Where has it ever gotten out of that stubborn bracket? And that's high tax rates or low tax rates. You have less economic growth, right, when you have higher general tax rates. You have a little better economic growth when your rates are lower. Do you agree with that?
In general, that's what our analysis.
Okay, good. We're getting somewhere. So with everything we've just talked about, we're in a mess because revenues have never budged much beyond that. High rates or low rates, economic growth generally gets worse the higher the rates are, so you give up something there. Isn't this something that should be as simple as, how do we take the money the taxpayers give us and just figure out how to spend less than we take in, and acknowledge that the system has never given us more than about 18% of our GDP? Is that a fair statement?
Of course, CBO wouldn't recommend a policy. We would say.
But just look at their arithmetic.
Yeah.
Is that a fair statement?
Arithmetically, it's a fair statement. It's one or the other. It's got to be revenue.
Then I'll go back to what I think besets the whole system, because we all have priorities for within it. Healthcare is actually fixable. I did it in my own business, but you're poking the biggest lobbies back home and here if you do that. At least if they want to call themselves free enterprise, they ought to start acting like it. I think we can accomplish that. But then we're going to have to get down to what works in any other place. You don't have the benefit of the printing press in the basement or a credit card that gets renewed regardless of your bad behavior. You do go to Chapter 11, and you generally end up on the ash heap if you don't correct it in a year or two, meaning Chapter 7. We got to get some political will and backbone around this place. Our future generations, it's shameful that we keep projecting the Bidenomics, the Biden plan, to where we're $52 trillion in debt. Bad business plan, never going to end up well, and it has no relation to fixing programs we want to save. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator. Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of you for your testimony. Mr. Schwagel, I just want to ask you a question about the share of revenue as a percent of GDP. Isn't it the case that the last time we had a balanced budget in this country, the share of revenue to GDP was approximately 19 to 20%?
That's right, in the late 90s in the Clinton administration.
Right. I don't think there's anything immutable about 18% revenues as a share of GDP. In fact, we know mathematically if we increase taxes on very, very wealthy people, we will be able to increase our share of revenue as a percent of GDP. Mr. Goss, you are the undisputed expert when it comes to Social Security and the numbers, and a respected one. Could you just, and you may have said this, but for the record, what will the cut be if we do nothing to Social Security, and when will it happen?
if we do not act and the trustees' intermediate assumptions follow through, as of 2033, the Old Age and Survivors Insurance Program will at that point deplete its reserves. The trust fund will still be there. It won't be exhausted or whatever. It'll deplete its reserves. Continuing income will be sufficient to, at that point, continue paying 77% of benefits. That's a long way from running out of money and no benefits, but it's far short of what people are expecting.
Right. So you're saying it would be a 23% benefit cut?
At that point.
At that point in time. And I understand that both you and Mr. Schwagel have already stated, which seems like pretty simple math, that in order to avoid those cuts, we either need more revenue into the program or you'd need some combination of structured cuts and revenue into the program. I just want to make sure all of our other witnesses agree that that is a mathematical fact, starting with you, Ms. Romeck.
I agree.
I agree.
Yes.
Thank you. So then the question is, how do we get there? And I think the chairman pointed out earlier that when President Biden gave his State of the Union address, one of the lines where he got a standing ovation was where he said we're not going to cut Social Security benefits. I haven't seen any proposal from our Republican colleagues on how to make sure that we prevent this 23% cut in about a decade. I have seen proposals from the chairman, Mr. Whitehouse, Senator Sanders, and others, and I support those proposals. But just to my colleagues, with respect to making tough political choices, you can't have a dialogue and debate without everybody putting their positions on the table on Social Security. So folks may disagree with the proposals that have been put forward, but we welcome looking at alternative proposals. And I do not believe that assigning this responsibility to some commission that acts behind closed doors is the way to do it, because in my experience, that does not avoid the fundamental challenge, which is the question of political will, ultimately, to get it done. I do agree with points that were made earlier about we need a lot of options on the table. Another revenue option that I put forward in the past was to take the estate tax back to where it was in 2009 as part of the Bush tax cuts. And I would propose dedicating some of those revenues to the purpose of shoring up Social Security, which is not a revolutionary idea. It's an idea that was supported by Bob Ball, the longest serving member of the Social Security Commission, supported by Nancy Altman, the president of Social Security Works, and supported by Thomas Paine, who launched this idea even before we had Social Security, saying, the quote, "It is from overgrown acquisition of property that the fund will support itself," meaning a fund to support seniors as they retire. So I would just ask in closing if I could ask you, Ms. Hanauser, just to comment quickly on the estate tax as a source of revenue generally, and to debunk the idea that if we go back to that proposal, that middle class folks would suffer. And in fact, it would just be folks who are very well off, right?
Thank you very much. People can now inherit $22 million tax-free through our estate tax, and they can inherit far more than that through clever use of trusts. So I would agree entirely that that is a right place to look for revenue.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of you.
Thank you, Senator Van Hollen. We next have Senator Scott, followed by Senator Lujan.
Okay. First, I want to thank the chairman for holding this, and I agree with Senator Van Hollen. I think we all, and it's similar to what Senator Johnson said, I think we all ought to maybe get around the table and come up with all the different ideas. And probably I think something Senator Johnson was saying, let's all get all the facts in front of us first, because there's a lot of misconceptions about Social Security and how it started and what, the ways to fix it. So we've got a lot of Social Security Medicare recipients in my state, Florida. So I proposed legislation that's called the Protect Our Seniors Act that would safeguard the benefits of these critical entitlements. It does three important things. First, we send the funding of 87,000 more IRS agents and put that money in Social Security and Medicare. Second would say any savings with, if there's a way to come up with savings in Medicare, and there clearly is, we keep those in Medicare. Last fall, there was legislation that was passed that cut the spending in Medicare, but unfortunately that money was taken outside of the Medicare program, and so instead keeping it in. Finally, would it establish a rule to prevent cuts to Medicare and Social Security unless you had 2/3 of Congress willing to do that? So, because I think we all have to figure out, I think all of us have said we've got to figure this out. So we've had since 2019 about a 1.8% increase in our population. Dr. Swigel, how much in dollar numbers, how much is to go back to the 2019 budget, Biden's proposed budget this year, how much is that? How much increase would that be in the total spending?
Total spending from 2019, I don't have 2019 in front of me. It's gone up, spending as a share of the economy and in dollars.
It's about I think it's about $2 trillion. Okay. Wouldn't that be close?
It's in the trillions, that's right.
Yeah. So, Mr. Goss, how much would it cost this year to fully fund where there was no deficit in Social Security, however you do it? How much dollars are we talking about just in this fiscal year?
Yeah, this year the cash deficit was I had it before me, $145 billion is what we have this year.
So we've had a $2 trillion increase in our budget, okay? And to fix Social Security, we could have taken some of that money from other programs and put $145 billion, and that would have fully funded Social Security.
That's the primary deficit this year. So that's in substance what we're drawing from the trust fund.
Just for 1 year.
That would be just for 1 year what we're drawing from the trust fund.
Right.
That's the instance of the cash gap.
Right. And I think everybody would agree that this is a pretty big issue for every American thinks about this. Whether, maybe my grandkids don't think about it much, but I think anybody's thinking about their retirement. So what do you all think of Joe Biden's proposal right now? What do you think of his proposal to fix Social Security? What do each of you think about it?
During the presidential campaign,
No, the one like in his budget, the one he would have this right now in his budget.
I don't believe there is anything.
I said we analyze the president's budget every year, and we did not analyze any Social Security proposals.
So he has no proposal to fix Social Security, one of the biggest issues. He's the sitting president of the United States. Number two, that's the first question. So in the budget, when they came and talked about the budget, what was the response when anybody asked about what they were doing to fix Social Security? Did they say what they were doing when they came and talked about it, when OMB came and talked to this budget committee? So
I don't know, that's beyond the role of CBO.
Right.
But
so we've said here we've increased our budget by $2 trillion in 5 years. All right. Right now we could fix Social Security with some of that money. It would take $145 billion out of $2 trillion, and there's not one thing that Joe Biden has done to fix it.
Yeah, and just to make sure that the 145 is the 1 year cash balance. There's lots of other
budget, but the budget's up $2 trillion, right?
Yeah, no, and we of course we would analyze any proposals. So.
Right. So, I mean, I think that what's frustrating here is we know this is one of the biggest issues we have. We've seen an unbelievable increase in our spending and been nothing by this president to do anything to solve it. So, Mr. Chairman, I think we ought to go back to what Senator Johnson brought up. Let's all sit down and talk about this in our entire budget. If the biggest issue we've got is retirement benefits, which I think most Americans would say it's one of the top 3 issues they're dealing with. It's inflation, it's retirement benefits, and medical bills. And this committee, I think we have every opportunity to solve it. So I hope we'll take that opportunity. But I want to thank each of you for being here.
Senator Lujan, let me reassure Mr. Goss that we will wrap up after Senator Lujan. I know you have a very hard stop. You will be free to exit as I give closing remarks. You don't need to stick around for that, but do stick around for Senator Lujan's question.
I would not want to miss those.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Goss. My line of questioning is for Ms. Roming as well, so I appreciate if someone has to get going as well, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Roming, my series of questions are yes or no's, and it's about Social Security as a program. Yes or no, is Social Security an incredibly effective anti-poverty program?
Yes.
Is it correct to say that Social Security keeps 22 million Americans out of poverty?
Yes.
In New Mexico, it's about 122,000 people as well.
That's correct.
Yes or no, Social Security helps 15 million American seniors stay out of poverty?
Yes.
Is it true that without Social Security, 38% of seniors would live in poverty?
Yes.
Is it true that Social Security disability and survivors is one of the most impactful anti-poverty programs for children?
Yes.
Is Social Security the primary life and disability insurance for almost all American children?
Yes.
In fact, Social Security is the primary life and disability insurance protection for about 480,000 children in New Mexico. Yes or no, Social Security lifts over 1 million children out of poverty each year?
Yes.
Social Security is also the most important source of income for the over 50,000 children living in New Mexico's grand family households. As we know, more and more grandparents are raising grandkids, just to highlight that. Yes or no, with longer life expectancies, is it true that older Hispanics benefit greatly from Social Security?
Yes.
In New Mexico, over 90,000 Hispanic households have received benefits. Is it true that without Social Security, the poverty rate among Hispanic seniors would increase dramatically? The numbers I have are from 19% to 45%.
Yes, that's correct.
And nationwide, Social Security lifts 1.3 million older Hispanics out of poverty?
Yes.
Yes? And lastly, I also want to point out that in New Mexico, Social Security provides benefits to 1 in 4 tribal households, resulting in about 14,000 households benefit. Mr. Chairman, the reason for my line of questioning is I appreciate the expertise on the committee and the questions that were asked before. I think oftentimes we fail to impress the importance of some of these programs that we're talking about. I certainly agree with the assessment from Senator Van Hollen that all of us, with our observation with the State of the Union, that the largest applause line, or one of them, came bipartisanly, Democrats and Republicans, not just clapping, but standing and clapping, when the President said we should not cut Social Security and Medicare. I agree with that. But it's also important to remember why these programs matter. And so as there are evaluations taking place associated with this President's budget proposals, many packages that we passed bipartisanly to make investments, historic investments in infrastructure across America, in the previous administration, revenues were dramatically reduced. There was a tax package that came across then, if I remember correctly, and I remember a lot of my constituents calling it a tax scam because what was promised was not delivered. Well, that was $3 trillion, Mr. Chairman, if I remember correctly. So that plus where we are today, I mean, math is a funny thing. The statistics professor once told me that numbers don't lie, but liars can figure. You can make the numbers look like whatever you want. And I certainly hope that as we get to the bottom of this, I always have a simple approach, Mr. Chairman, that if indeed we all believe that these programs matter and that we should find solutions, that we develop them, put them on the table, stipulate to a set of facts, and negotiate from there and move a package forward that is going to be good for the American people. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, I want to make sure that I am respectful to Mr. Goss. I'll yield back the balance of my time. I appreciate everybody being here, what you've spent your lives doing, and what you continue to do. Now, let's just go and fix it. Let's make it better for everybody. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
In response to the comments that have been made by a number of senators regarding further conversations on this question, I would point out that President Biden made a proposal, which is that we solve the Social Security problem without benefit cuts. That's a pretty significant piece of the overall solution, and it received a bipartisan standing ovation in the State of the Union. So I think he's had a pretty significant accomplishment in that regard. As to how we fill in the revenue gap that results, I have a proposal. It is the subject of this hearing. Mr. Goss, who is the actuary for Social Security, has reviewed it. It is called the Medicare and Social Security Fair Share Act. It is available for everybody to look at, kick the tires, fight about, do whatever you want. If we are going to have a conversation of some kind, that is not going to happen unless we have a Republican proposal to work with, something that is distinct and clear and in writing. I've spent enough time in the Senate to think that freewheeling chat among senators is rarely productive. Actual bills, actual proposals are the things that lead to actual agreements. So if we start getting actual Republican proposals or agreements, I'm more than happy to work with my very distinguished ranking member and friend to figure out how we conduct negotiations and go forward. But in the meantime, I think that would be the logical next step. I thank the witnesses for appearing before the committee. Your full written statements will be included in the record. Without objection, I enter into the record the estimate from Chief Actuary Goss of the Medicare and Social Security Fair Share Act, showing that the bill would ensure Social Security solvency for more than 75 years. Without objection, I enter into the record a letter from the National Education Association in support of raising additional revenue for Social Security and strengthening the program's benefits. Questions for the record are due by noon tomorrow, and we ask the witnesses, if they receive such questions, to respond to those questions within 7 days of receipt. The ranking member is already up and going, so I guess there's no further business before the committee, and the hearing is adjourned.